Hello, everybody. I hope everybody can see me and everybody can hear me okay. Welcome to LlewellynCon. Oh my gosh, I'm very excited to be sharing with you a presentation here at LlewellynCon 2024, and I'm the first one on. No pressure at all. Now, I do have a lovely slide, so hopefully, in a moment, my slideshow should load up onto your screens. Good morning. I can see you all saying hello in the chat. Hello, how are you all? Do say good morning and where you're from as well, because of course I'm on the other side of the Atlantic to most of you, but I also see that there's a few people from elsewhere across the world as well watching, and of course there's probably people watching back on the recording. So welcome, croeso to LlewellynCon 2024. You'll have to forgive me for the way that I say Llewellyn. It's just that I'm Welsh, so I say it the correct way. Sorry, not to throw shade, but essentially I say Llewellyn, because that's how we say it over here in Wales. So today I'm going to be talking to you about Welsh witchcraft and folk magic, which is a very big topic, and I can't quite cover everything that I'd love to in 30 minutes. So hopefully this will be kind of like the highlight reel of Welsh witchcraft and folk magic. So hopefully it'll give you a little taste for the type of work that I do and the type of things that I kind of write about and such. So let's dive in straight away. First and foremost, who am I? So, hello, my name is Mhara Starling. If you've never come across me before, you will come across me a lot now. I'm a lot like a rash. So now that you've rubbed up against me, you won't be able to get rid of me. So you will need either some anti-Mara fungal cream, or you just deal with the fact that you're stuck with me forever now. I do all sorts of things across social media and in person, and I write books. So I'm an author. I'm a Welsh person, dwi'n rhywun Cymraeg. So if you speak Welsh, os ydych chi'n siarad Gymraeg, hello. I'm also a person who likes to share things online. So you might have seen me on TikTok. I like to jump out of bushes and act like a flamboyant fairy over there. And then I also do YouTube videos where I dive into certain topics to do with Welsh magic and lore. But we can talk about all those later. But to give you a little introduction to who I am, my name is Mhara, originally from North Wales, from the Isle of Anglesey, Ynys Môn. I'm obviously a Welsh person, a Welsh speaker. I'm a witch, first and foremost. I refer to myself as a Swyn Wraig in my native language, and we'll get into what that word means later on in the presentation. But in English, the closest word possible would probably be Welsh folk witch, which means that I'm a witch who incorporates various elements and aspects of Welsh folklore, folk magic, traditional kind of magical beliefs into my modern day practice as a witch today. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an introduction to who I am. But like I said, I'm like a rash. So even if that doesn't, you'll find out soon enough. But I do see that a lot of people in the chat are saying hello and that they like my videos and such. So nice to see some people that I recognize as well. Lovely. So before we dive into the rest of this presentation, I think the first thing we need to cover is what exactly is Wales, which might be a bit of a silly question, but you know, if we're going to be talking about Welsh witchcraft, well, where does this witchcraft come from? Where do these traditions and pieces of lore and magic that we're going to be talking about today originate from? And what can I tell you about Cymru, about Wales as a place, first and foremost? So let me give you an introduction to Wales. So whales are aquatic mammals. That's the wrong Wales. Sorry, give me a second. That's better. There we go. That Wales, not Wales with a H, not Wales as in woo, Wales as in Cymru, Cymru am byth. So what is Wales? Let me give you a brief introduction to the place that I am from. So Wales is a country that is located in the western region of the United Kingdom. It's there on screen right now. Some people say that Wales looks a bit like a pig, like a pig or a woman riding a pig. I think it just looks like an old lady reaching for her walking stick with Anglesey up there as its head and such. I lived I grew up, I was raised, and my family still live on that island right at the very tippy top at the north up there. So I lived on the never eat shredded wheat western side of the island when you're looking at it on a map like this. So Wales is one of the modern day day Celtic nations. Now, the reason we're classed as a Celtic nation is because we are a nation that speaks primarily a Celtic language, or I wouldn't say primarily anymore, unfortunately, due to that little thing called colonialism. But we do have a native Celtic language that is embedded into our culture, and our culture expresses itself through a very Celtic lens, which means that we're one of the modern Celtic nations alongside Scotland and Cornwall. So Scotland, Cornwall, and Wales are the Celtic nations located on what is now Britain. Then there's also, of course, Ireland across the sea, Brittany over in the north of France, and there's a few others. But essentially, those are the modern day Celtic nations, and they're classed as Celtic nations primarily because of our Celtic language. So the Celtic languages are kind of split into two family groups. You've got the Goidelic Celtic languages, which includes things like Irish, Manx, Scottish Gaelic, and such. And then you've got the Brythonic side of the family. So they're all Celtic, but they're two sides of the same family, if that makes sense. And on the Brythonic side of the family, you have us, Cymru, Cymraeg, Welsh, and you have like Cornish and Brezoneg and such. So all of these languages come under that Brythonic flag. So that's two different expressions of two different Celtic kind of families there. So Wales, in and of itself, is a nation that has long been suppressed and overlooked and misunderstood, with many people believing that we are simply just part of England. I've met so many people over my life who didn't even know that we existed. So to give you an example, I went away for university. I crossed the border into England and I went to university in Manchester, and it baffled me the amount of people I met from other parts of the world, because I went to a very international university that had a lot of international students. So I met people from the Netherlands and New Caledonia and Germany and such, who didn't even know that Wales existed, let alone that we were our own country with our own language and such. So yeah, that's something that is kind of the offshoot of a lot of this suppression that the country has dealt with over the years. So many people believe that we're part of England, but that is not the case, though we do deal with the repercussions of being what some term as the blueprint for a lot of British colonization, essentially. So there was a lot of attempts to try and squash down and get rid of our culture. Our culture was often seen as barbaric and backwards and, you know, something that shouldn't exist in the enlightened world and all of this. So for absolute centuries, there was a huge campaign to try and essentially break down the Welsh language, where they would do all manners of horrific crap just to try and suppress the language and get rid of it. But they did not succeed. They did not succeed. A lot of people will tell you that Welsh is a minority language. It is a minority language. Some people might even tell you that it's a dead language, that we don't have a language that's like living and spoken today. That's not true. So I grew up on Ynys Môn, the Isle of Anglesey, again, right at the very top of that map on screen right now, the island that is kind of right at the top, looks a bit like a head with two ears. So I grew up there, and I grew up specifically in a village called Aberfraw, and the community I was immersed in was entirely Welsh speaking. We didn't speak English on the streets to each other. We didn't speak English at home. It was just through the medium of Welsh. When I went to school, it was all through the Welsh language. Again, in high school, all through the Welsh language. It was only when I left to go to university at 19 years old that I started speaking English regularly. And so Welsh has been a huge part of my upbringing, and it is the same for a lot of people across Wales. Though we are a minority language, we are still here and we're still alive. So that gives you a little introduction to Wales. So we are this glorious place in the west of what is now the United Kingdom. We have our own culture, our own language, our own identity, and we're still here. Da ni yma o hyd. So, moving on from that, let's move on to talk about magic, witchcraft, and paganism in Wales today. So when we're talking about magic, witchcraft, and paganism in Wales today, the one thing I would like to preface all of what I'm about to say with is that it isn't too dissimilar to everywhere else in the world nowadays, especially here in kind of, you know, Western Europe and over in the States and such, what you find here in Wales today is a very eclectic mix of a very diverse set of paganism, witchcraft, and magic. So, though we have our own traditions, our own folk magical traditions, our own mythologies, all of this kind of stuff, though we have all of that, there are a lot of people who instead draw their inspiration for their magical or spiritual practices from elsewhere. And that was always something that kind of got to me when I was growing up, because I grew up having been immersed in the Welsh language. As somebody mentioned in the chat just now, though it's a minority language, it was a majority language for me. And having grown up in the Welsh schooling system and such, I was privileged to have grown up with the stories of the Mabinogi, with the kind of myths and legends and folk tales and such that are woven into our landscape, and the magic that is woven into our landscape as well. And so it always kind of made me sad when I met people here in Wales, when I attended moots and pagan gatherings, and people would introduce themselves to me and they would be like, oh yes, my name is Rhiannon and I'm a Welsh witch. My patron goddess is Isis and I look predominantly at ancient Egyptian magic. And that's not to say there's anything wrong with that. You know, people will turn to whatever inspires them and whatever draws them. And sometimes we don't have a choice over which gods call to us, do we? But it always made me a little sad that a lot of people in Wales did not seem to have a grasp of their own culture's backgrounds. And when I talked to people about this, when I asked them, why aren't we looking at the gods in our own backyard? Why aren't we looking at the spirits that surround us here? Why are we looking to ancient Greek or ancient Egypt, or to the cultures, which some people were doing, looking to the cultures of the Native Americans and such, and appropriating a lot of stuff from their cultures to create a new spiritual practice? Why were we doing that if we had our own? And the same answer seemed to prop up every single time. And that was, well, I don't know anything about the magic of here. And that made me really sad. And that was kind of the main drive for writing my book. It was one of the main things that made me go, you know, if nobody else is going to talk about it, I'm going to. But I wasn't the only one talking about it, because we do have an expression of paganism here, which is very, very kind of native to this place, but also very modern, not something that is steeped in huge antiquity and yet is very workable in the landscape that we have here. And that is modern druidry. So modern druidry exists in Wales as probably one of the primary ways that people turn to paganism today. I meet a lot more druids than I do witches, of like the older generations and such, whereas people of my generation and younger tend to call themselves witches more likely. But druidry is very interesting when we look at it within the specifically Welsh context, because we have ties to druidry that are very, very intimate. And not just because this is a landscape where the ancient druids would have once existed, also because we are basically the cradle of what eventually became modern druidry, revival druidry, druidry in its modern format. So, for example, to give you a little bit of an insight into Welsh culture, one of the events that is the most important events of the year for us in Wales is the National Eisteddfod. And I know some of you, if you come from places like South Africa, Australia, places like that, you're probably thinking now, well, we have Eisteddfods, we have those too. And it's because they were brought over by people from Wales who were going over and making a new life for themselves in these places. So the Eisteddfod is something that is rooted in Welsh culture. And it's a cultural festival that we have at a certain point in the year where we celebrate art and music and poetry and just the culture of Wales in general. And the National Eisteddfod was started in its modern format by a guy called Iolo Morgannwg. Iolo Morgannwg. And Iolo Morgannwg was basically one of the most influential voices when it came to the rise of what we call revivalist druidry. So he created a lot of what we see now as the tenets of modern druidry, a lot of the core foundational aspects of modern druidry. You know, Iolo Morgannwg's work went on to inspire people like Ross Nichols, who then went on to inspire people like Gerald Gardner. So we see a lot of crossover with a lot of streams of modern druidry as well as modern witchcraft, which seem to pull on the same threads as Welsh Druidry. So here in Wales, like I said, the Eisteddfod is run by a group of people known as the Gorsedd. And the Gorsedd are basically druids. They gather in what looks like a huge stone circle in the middle of the festivities, and they do rituals and rites, and they blow trumpets into the four winds, and they call for magical peace with their sword of ceremony and such. So essentially, Druidry is woven into the very fabric of Welsh culture as it is today. And so it makes sense that a lot of people turn to Druidry as their main expression when it comes to a modern pagan expression here in Wales. Now, I kind of straddle both worlds. I'm a witch, I'm a folk witch, I'm a Swyn Wraig, as I call myself, but I'm also a member of the Anglesey Druid Order. So I have both of those kind of loves in my life. I have Druidry and I have witchcraft. So what we're going to talk about primarily today, however, is witchcraft and folk magic. So moving on from there, I would say the primary tenet of not just modern witchcraft, but also modern paganism in total, when it comes to a specifically Welsh lens, is that a lot of the information which creates and helps us to form the practice that we have today is that we are inspired and informed by the past. So what do I mean by that? How are people inspired and informed by the past? Well, first and foremost, we can look to the ancient past. So humans, or I should say human-like beings, have existed and occupied this region, so Wales and Britain as a whole, for almost 1,000,000 years. And they left their footprints, and that's to say, they left a lot of remnants of who they were. Not to say that we know exactly who they were and what they did and what they were getting up to, but we can kind of get a little hint by looking at the landscape itself. So if you've ever visited Wales, one thing you'll notice is that you can't kick a rock here without hitting an ancient sacred monument in some way or another. There are circles of stone, standing stones, burial chambers, cairns, all sorts of monuments that date back to prehistory that line the landscape. And it's easy to look at these landmarks and become inspired, to feel that there's something quite arcane and old and magical about them. We have no idea what those sites were made for. They're in the same kind of style as, Stonehenge and Avebury and those very famous ones. One of the most popular ones near where I grew up is Bryn Cyhythu, which is the mound in the dark grove. It's a beautiful, beautiful place and very magical. So you can understand how people look at these places and they become inspired to connect to something beyond themselves, deep into the ancient past. So we do look at those, even though we don't know exactly what those monuments were for, we tend to see them as kind of a gateway, as a place to connect between our world and the ancient world. So a way to connect to our ancestors, so to speak. Then, of course, there's the Celtic past. So we still speak a Celtic language here in Wales today. We still speak Cymraeg. Cymraeg, or Welsh, is the descendant of the common Brythonic language, which was the old language spoken here by the Brythonic peoples, people that lived here long before the Romans came, or the Anglo-Saxons came, or the Jutes came and such. Before that all happened, we had the Brythonic people, the Brythonic tribes, who all had their own little dialect of Brythonic, and eventually that Brythonic language evolved into what we now call Welsh, modern Welsh. So we still carry a bit of our Celtic culture with us today, hence why we are a modern Celtic nation. But that Celtic history, and I'm not going to get into the intricacies of the controversial nature of the term Celtic now, you can look that up elsewhere, but the idea of a culture that expresses itself in kind of Celtic manners has existed in this landscape since around 700 BC and still continues to influence a lot of the culture. So of course we're going to look to that for inspiration. We then have, of course, the bardic tradition, which grew out of a lot of this Celtic culture and such. So after the Romans left Britain around the 5th century, Wales as we know it today began to form. And when it began to emerge out of the mists of time, a bardic and literary culture started to emerge as well. So the bards were these very kind of, when we think of poets today, when we think of people who write poetry today, we tend to think of kind of hermit-like individuals who kind of sulk around in their bedrooms writing very romantic poetry about love or something like that. But the bards of the ancient world, they weren't like that. They had the ear of royalty. They had the bend and the pull of the public in general. So they were considered inherently powerful because their words could shift a nation in and of itself. And they recorded poetry, and by recording poetry, they recorded elements of lore and history. And by lore, I'm not meaning like law as in law and order. I mean lore as in Lore, as in folklore and such like that. So there's a lot that the bards did for our culture, but also we can look to that as magical practitioners, because what we tend to get from that is the importance and the power of spoken word, of poetry, and of Awen. And we'll talk about Awen a little more later. Then after that, we also have folklore and folk magic. So throughout Wales's history, we have evidence of folk tales and folk traditions and even magical practices that we can draw upon. So all of these things kind of act as a basic framework or a foundation for us to draw upon to create essentially a practice that works in the here and now. But what's important is that we are inspired and informed by the past, but rooted in the here and now. We are modern people. We're not our ancestors, you know? We are modern people. So it's important to remember that as well. So moving on from that, we then have Welsh deities. So the Mabinogi mythology and folklore records a lot of entities that we could see as deities. And a lot of these deities that derive from Wales itself are very popular today in various streams of modern paganism and witchcraft. So some of these might be familiar to some of you who are here today. So that could be like Rhiannon, Gwyn ap Nudd, Arianrhod, or Aranrhod, I like to call her, Ceridwen and such. A lot of these names will be familiar to anyone who practices a form of modern paganism and witchcraft, because they were popular among the pioneers of modern paganism and witchcraft, but they have their origin here in Welsh culture. And so they are part of my practice as well as a modern day Welsh witch. Now, there is a debate as to whether or not the gods are really gods, because we don't have any evidence of any cults or shrines dedicated to them that predate Christianity. We don't have any evidence of them prior to the medieval period. So there are some people that argue that, oh no, they're not gods, they're just medieval literary characters. My argument to that is, number one, we can look at it historically and see that there are many cognates in the names of some of these characters from medieval literature and older Welsh deities, Celtic deities. So for example, we see a comparison between Mabon, not Mabon, Mabon, who is a character in the medieval Welsh texts, and the older kind of Brythonic god Maponos. So we have this cognate name between Maponos and Mabon, which means that some of the older gods of Gaul, of Celtic Britain, of ancient Wales, essentially, might have influenced and inspired some of this lore and mythology that is woven into medieval literature. But without that, despite that, regardless of all that, one argument I always make is, well, even if they weren't gods in the ancient past, they are gods now, because they are loved and worshipped by varieties of people across the world to this day. So via the process of apotheosis, that's the process of making something divine, they definitely are gods today. So moving on from deities. So one thing I want to try and cover in this talk, is Welsh magical practitioners, because we have an abundance of them within our folklore, within our mythologies, within our histories. So here are just some examples. These are just 4 examples, and there are so many more of magical practitioners native to Wales. The first one is Awenyddion. So the Awenyddion translates literally to means the inspired ones, or those who are touched by inspiration. So the Awenyddion are described historically as comparable to oracles. They enter into trance-like states to receive messages and visions from the divine. So the first kind of recorded evidence we have of the Awenyddion comes from the 12th century, and they're described as being these people who can enter into trance-like states by connecting to the divine, and then they utter out these secret, arcane pieces of wisdom that can give you guidance in life. So they're almost like the ancient version of, Psychic Sally down the road, who you go for a tarot reading. People would go to these people when they needed help. The next one on that list is Swynydd, Swynwraig, and Swynwr. So Swynydd, the first one there, is gender neutral. Swynwraig is specifically feminine, Swynwraig. And Swynwr, the last one there, is masculine. So this is a term to describe a practitioner of Swyn Gyfaredd. Now, Swyn Gyfaredd is one expression of native Welsh folk magic. So the people who practiced Swyn Gyfaredd, they were the charmers. They were the magical specialists who aided the community via their magical abilities. So beyond that, we also have the Gwr or Gwraig Hysbys or Cyfarwydd. These are the Welsh equivalents to cunning folk. They were learned people who practiced magic and they dealt their trade via magic. So people would come to them and pay them to do magic, essentially. Then there's also the Consiriwr, the conjurer, not too dissimilar from the above, the conjurer, the cunning folk and such, except that they tended to dabble in slightly darker, more sinister arts, consorting with diabolical spirits. So those are just some of the words we have to describe magical practitioners in Wales, historically and folklorically and mythologically. But we do have other words that some of you who might have an interest in Welsh stuff might be thinking, where's that word? Where's that other word that I've seen for witch? And that would probably be this one, right at the top of the screen there. Gwrach. So what is a witch in Welsh? If you were to ask somebody today what a witch is in Welsh, they would say gwrach. But gwrach is a bit of a loaded term because historically it never meant witch. Initially, it was a word that described anything that was disgusting, anything that was disgusting and diabolical. So if you saw something slimy and hideous, you'd go, oh, a grach, I don't like that. I don't like that gwrach right there. And then eventually this term became associated as a kind of slur thrown at any women who were considered undesirable, too old, too ugly by society's standards. So it became a hideous word thrown at any woman who didn't fit into society's standards. But then after that, it somehow became associated with witches. So now it has kind of stuck as this word for a witch. But I prefer to use one of those other words. I prefer to use one of the terms that actually describes a form of magical practitioner native to our lands. And one of the reasons I prefer that is because those words are starting to get lost. So words like Swynydd, words like Gwr a Gwraig Hysbys, words like Consiriwr and Awenydd and such. People in Wales today might not know those terms, but they'll know gwrach. So I usually try and stick to some of those actual native expressions of magical practice rather than this word that just nowadays means a Halloween caricature of a witch or something disgusting. But if you're looking for something rooted in folklore, there is also the word gwyddan, which shares a common root with words for trees and science. So Wales has an odd history when it comes to witchcraft. Witchcraft persecutions were extremely low, and I can't go into detail about this because I'm running out of time. But essentially, Wales had a very odd and peculiar relationship with witchcraft in that we didn't seem to persecute as many witches. And some have decided that that probably means that we had a better relationship with magic. We were so connected with magic and deeply entrenched in this idea that magic existed as part of the community that there were entire propaganda manuals created with the intention of persuading the Welsh that magic is bad. So that gives you a little insight into just how much magic was a part of everyday life. We had to be convinced that magic was bad, and we didn't like holding witch trials. You know, to give you some of that in numbers, for example, England had upwards of 2,000 witch trials and 500 executions, whereas Wales only had upwards of about 40, just over 40 witch trials and only a handful, so like 4 or 5 executions. So yeah, gives you a little insight into the way we viewed magic and witchcraft. And magic in Wales expresses itself in various different ways. So I've already spoken a little bit about the bardic aspect of the spoken word. So spoken word is linked with bardic magic, but also the concept of awen. So awen is this divine force of inspiration that flows from the other world into our own world. And I have a video all about awen on YouTube if you'd like to learn more about that. So the spoken word is a powerful magical tool within a Welsh specific context. We also have various traditions associated with blessing and healing, from utilizing sacred waters to magical objects that are said to hold healing powers. We also have natural forms of magic. So most forms of magic tend to draw upon the natural world, but we also have traditions traditions of herbal medicine and natural-based magic, and even magic that utilizes things you wouldn't expect. So, for example, there are entire documents that go back into history throughout Wales of the folk magical application and usage of snake skin. So the shed skin, the skin that is naturally shed from a snake. You know how snakes naturally shed their skin? Well, it was said if you found that skin and you burnt it and turned it into a powder, that powder had a variety of different uses, including keeping things away, so protection, banishing people that you didn't want, keeping people from being able to lie, and healing all sorts of ailments. And then over from that, we then have cursing traditions. So cursing was quite a common occurrence here in Wales. You won't find different things, different kind of little pieces of law telling you that cursing is bad here in Wales. So we tend to see a lot of instances where women in particular, because women were considered the most powerful when it came to cursing, would utilize various cursing acts, including falling to their knees, pulling out their boobs, shaking their boobs, and throwing all sorts of swear words at whoever they were cursing. And that kind of wraps me up today. It brings me to my 30 minutes. So diolch, thank you so much for coming along to this talk. It was quite a quick talk, so I'm apologizing for that. I tried to cram as much as possible into here, but if you do want to learn more, I do have 2 books, one of them available for pre-order, one of them available for sale right now. So Welsh Witchcraft is out now, and you can read about all of these different things in that. Or if you'd like to learn more about fairy traditions and how they link with magic and witchcraft here in Wales, because there's a huge link there, then Welsh Fairies is available to pre-order now. Otherwise, you can find me across social media. Like I said, I'm like a rash, so you're going to find me now. I've got a Patreon, I've got Facebook, I've got Instagram, I'm everywhere. So just come find me. My YouTube is also a good place to find a lot of this information as well. So yes, diolch, thank you so much for joining me. Does anybody have any quick questions? I don't think I have time, but if you do have any questions, do feel free to message me or send me anything over various social media platforms, and I'll try and get to you as soon as I can.